Nobody could fix the dead. John Deere 4020, a 70-year-old farmer, started it in 10 minutes. The tractor died on a Thursday morning in late September of 1987. Just stopped. Merle Cutler had been running it across the North Field in Calhoun County, Illinois, pulling a 3-bottom plow through soil that hadn't been turned since June, when the engine cut out without a cough or a sputter. One moment it was running, the next it wasn't. He sat on the seat for a few seconds, listening to the silence where the diesel had been. Then he climbed down. Merle was 70 years old, had been farming this same 340 acres along the bluffs above the Illinois River since 1951. The John Deere 4020 was a 1968 model he'd bought used from a dealer in Hardin in 1972 for $4,200. It had 6,800 hours on the meter when he bought it. Had another 9,000 on it now. He'd rebuilt the injection pump twice, replaced the clutch pack, put in a new water pump in the summer of 1983. The tractor had earned its keep. That was not in question. What was in question was whether it would earn any more. The North Field was 80 acres. He had 60 of it left to plow. The window for fall tillage in Calhoun County ran maybe 6 more weeks before the ground froze. He stood next to the 4020 in the late September sun, which was still warm at mid-morning, and looked at the machine the way a man looks at something he doesn't understand yet. He tried to restart it. The starter turned. The engine did not catch. He tried again. Same result. The fuel gauge read 3/4 full. The oil pressure light was not on when it had died. Temperature gauge had been normal. Nothing had warned him. It had simply quit. Merle walked the half-mile back to the farmhouse. Made a phone call to Dale Pruitt at Pruitt Implement in Hardin. Dale had been the John Deere dealer for that county for 22 years. Knew the 4020 platform as well as anyone in the region. He sent a mechanic out that afternoon. Young man named Kevin, maybe 28 years old, drove out in a white service truck with the green John Deere stripe on the door. Spent an hour on the tractor. Checked the fuel system, pulled injectors, ran a compression test. Came back to where Merle was standing with a clipboard. Kevin told him it wasn't the injectors, wasn't the fuel pump. Compression was low across all 6 cylinders, but nothing catastrophic. Could be the timing. Could be something internal. Would need to take it to the shop for further diagnosis. He quoted a minimum of $400 just to get it on the lift and opened up. Possibly more, depending on what they found. Merle told him he'd think about it. Kevin drove back to Hardin. Merle stood in the North Field as the afternoon light shifted and the air cooled, looking at the dead tractor sitting on the unfinished ground. He didn't have $400 for shop time on an uncertain diagnosis. He had $217 in the checking account and a crop loan that wasn't going to square itself until the beans came in. The beans were 4 weeks from harvest. The corn was already in the bin. He was not broke in the permanent sense. He was broke in the seasonal sense that every cash grain farmer in the Illinois river bottoms understood. The money came when the crops came. Until then, you managed. He left the tractor in the field and drove to the feed store in Hardin the next morning for oil and hydraulic fluid he needed for another machine. Roy Simmons was there, same as most mornings. Roy was 73, 2 years older than Merle, had sold his farm in 1979 and now spent a portion of most days at the feed store not buying much of anything in particular. They'd known each other since before Roy's oldest was born. Roy asked about the 4020. Word moved fast in Calhoun County. Merle told him what Kevin had said. $400 minimum, uncertain diagnosis, could be more. Roy didn't say anything right away. Got himself a cup of coffee from the machine by the door. Stood there. He said he'd take a look at it if Merle wanted. Merle had known Roy Simmons since 1951. In that time, he had come to understand two things clearly. Roy Simmons did not volunteer for tasks he couldn't complete. And Roy Simmons had more practical mechanical knowledge in his hands than most men would accumulate in 2 lifetimes of professional work. What Roy knew about diesel engines specifically went back to the Korean War, where he'd kept equipment running in conditions that didn't allow for spare parts or shop time. He'd come home in 1953 and applied that knowledge to 26 years of farming, and then to 8 more years of just being Roy Simmons with time on his hands. They drove out to the North Field that Saturday morning in October. Cold by then. A frost had come through Thursday night and left the ground hard at the surface. The 40-20 sat where it had been, dew dried on the green paint, mud on the rear tires from the last pass it had made. Roy walked around it once without speaking. Checked the fuel cap, looked at the exhaust stack, leaned in and looked at the fuel filter. Opened the side panel and looked at the injection pump. He didn't have any tools with him yet. He was just looking. He asked Merle one question. He asked when Merle had last replaced the fuel line from the tank to the primary filter. Merle thought about it. Said he'd replaced the injection pump return lines in 1983. Couldn't recall the main feed line ever being changed. Roy nodded. Said he'd be back in a little while. He drove to the hardware store in Hardin, bought 6 feet of 3 to 8 inch fuel hose, 2 clamps, and a small hand pump. Came back to the field, spent 7 minutes replacing the main fuel feed line from the tank to the primary filter, which had been original to the tractor. The rubber had hardened and cracked on the inside, not visibly from the outside, but enough that it was collapsing under suction and starving the engine of fuel. No fuel, no combustion. The engine was not damaged. The timing was not off. The cylinders were fine. The tractor had not wanted anything except a piece of rubber hose that had been on it for 19 years. Roy primed the fuel system with a hand pump. Took about 4 minutes. Told Merle to try it. Merle climbed up, turned the key. The 40-20 started on the second compression stroke. Ran rough for 30 seconds while the air bled out, then smoothed to the idle it had always had. A low, even diesel knock that had been part of the sound of that farm for 15 years. Roy stood next to the tractor with his hands in his jacket pockets. Didn't say anything. The hose he'd replaced had cost $3.40. The clamps were 60 cents apiece. He'd been at the farm for less than 2 hours total, counting the drive to the hardware store. The tractor was running. Merle had spent the previous 48 hours contemplating a minimum $400 shop bill on a machine he wasn't sure was worth the repair. He was sitting on the seat of a running tractor because a 73-year-old man had looked at the fuel line. He sat there a moment, then put the 40-20 in gear. Kevin from Pruitt Implement had spent an hour checking injectors, pulling compression, writing notes on a clipboard. He was not wrong about what he'd checked. He hadn't been wrong that the compression was low. Low compression on a diesel with 15 to 800 hours wasn't unusual. It was expected. But low compression hadn't killed the engine. The fuel line had. Kevin had run a compression test and found a problem, then assumed the problem he'd found was the only problem. Roy Simmons had walked around the tractor once and asked about the fuel lines because he'd seen collapsed lines cause this exact symptom on equipment in Korea and on his own farm for 26 years after that. It was not that Kevin lacked knowledge. It was that Roy had a different kind. Merle finished the North Field over the next 4 days. The 40-20 ran without a problem. He pulled the 3-bottom plow across all 60 remaining acres, and the tractor didn't miss a beat. In the evenings, he came back to the farmhouse and made dinner, and didn't think much about what had happened beyond being glad the beans hadn't come in yet when the tractor died, because he'd have needed it for the combine header work and the timing would have been worse. He did think about the fuel line. He went back out to the machine shed and looked at the other lines on the 40-20. The return lines he'd replaced in 1983 were still good. The secondary filter inlet was original. He replaced it with the leftover hose Roy had brought. Another 180 in parts. He was thorough that way. The beans came in during the third week of October. Market price was $5.12 a bushel that fall. He averaged 44 bushels to the acre on 120 acres of beans, just over 5,200 bushels. The crop loan came square in the first week of November. He put $180 in the checking account against the next season. Roy Simmons came by the farm in early November, not about the tractor. He'd heard there was a Massey Ferguson 135 sitting at a farm sale in Pike County and thought Merle might want to look at it for a second tractor. Merle didn't need a second tractor right then, but they went to look anyway, because that's what they did. Roy knew 3 of the men running the sale from when their fathers had bought equipment from his father's neighbor in the 1940s. He could trace those connections out in detail if you had an hour and a cup of coffee, and sometimes even if you didn't. Merle told him, standing in the Pike County farmyard looking at the Massey, what he'd been thinking about since the North Field. He said that Kevin from Pruitt Implement had been out there for an hour, tested 6 different things, quoted him $400 to start. Roy had looked at one thing and fixed it in less than 10 minutes for 480s. Roy said Kevin was young. Merle said that wasn't it exactly. Roy said he supposed it wasn't. What it was, Merle thought, was that there was a difference between checking what the manual told you to check and knowing what a machine was likely to have done wrong based on having watched machines fail for 35 years. Kevin had followed procedure. Roy had applied experience. Both of those things had value. One of them had started his tractor. There was a family in Calhoun County, the Hellers, who had an operation about 3 times the size of Merle's. 2 full-time hired men, a shop with a proper lift, an account at Pruitt Implement that ran tens of thousands of dollars a year. Steve Heller was 44 years old and ran his farm with efficiency that Merle respected. He had modern equipment, proper diagnostics, all of it. When a machine went down in the Heller operation, it went to the shop or the shop came to it, and the cost got absorbed into a margin that could absorb it. Merle's margin didn't work that way. His 340 acres produced exactly enough to keep farming, which was the point. He was not going to expand, was not going to scale up. He was going to farm this ground until he couldn't anymore with what he had and make it work. Which meant that what Roy Simmons knew had a value to Merle that it didn't have to Steve Heller. That wasn't a criticism of Steve Heller. It was just arithmetic. Roy helped 6 other farmers in Calhoun County that year. Not as a business. Never charged. He'd come look at a machine, tell you what he thought, help you fix it if he could. A disc bearing on Walt Fromm's chisel plow. A hydraulic cylinder seal on the Gerber's tractor that had been leaking for 2 seasons. A starter solenoid on a pickup truck belonging to a woman named Eileen Kuster, who farmed 60 acres by herself after her husband passed in 1985. Roy had diagnosed that one over the phone and had her son replace the solenoid in the driveway in 40 minutes. Part cost $12. Nobody tracked these things formally. There was no ledger. Roy didn't expect anything back. He had time and knowledge, and that was what he did with both of them. It was the same impulse that had kept trucks running in the Korean winter, applied now to equipment sitting in river-bottom fields. The context had changed. The disposition hadn't. Merle sold the 4020 in the fall of 1994. He was 77 by then, and his son had taken over most of the heavy field work. The tractor had 17 to 200 hours on it at the point of sale. He got $3,800 for it from a farmer in Greene County who needed a workhorse tractor for his operation. It ran another 4 years in Greene County that Merle knew of. He heard about it secondhand through the auction network, the way you hear things. The piece of fuel hose Roy had replaced cost $340. It had been on the tractor for 19 years, from 1968 to 1987. The tractor ran for 7 more years after the repair, plus whatever time it had left in Greene County. For $3.40 in parts and 10 minutes of a 73-year-old man's time. Kevin from Pruitt Implement was not wrong to run a compression test. He ran it correctly. He was checking real problems. Low compression on a high-hour diesel is a real problem. But it was not the problem that had stopped the tractor. The problem that had stopped the tractor was a collapsed fuel line, and Roy Simmons knew to look for it because he had 35 years of watching diesel engines fail in the field. And in that 35 years, collapsed feed lines had stopped more engines than most of the problems on Kevin's diagnostic checklist. Experience doesn't make you right every time. Roy Simmons looked at his share of machines over the years and couldn't fix them. A cracked block on a case tractor in 1988 that needed professional welding. A failed injection pump on a combine that was beyond field repair. He knew what he knew, and he knew what he didn't know. That was part of it. What he brought to the 40-20 in that north field in October of 1987 was the ability to look at a problem and think first about what was likely before moving to what was possible. A 19-year-old rubber hose was more likely to be the problem than a simultaneous internal failure across 6 cylinders. The evidence pointed that way if you knew where to look. Roy looked there first. He died in March of 1996. He was 81 years old. The obituary in the Calhoun County newspaper was 3 paragraphs. It mentioned his service in Korea. It mentioned that he'd farmed in the county from 1953 to 1979. It mentioned his wife and his 4 children. It did not mention the tractor in the north field or the fuel hose or the Ford 80 or the other machines he'd fixed in the years after he sold his farm. Merle kept the leftover piece of fuel hose on a shelf in his machine shed. The piece Roy had cut from the roll and hadn't used. About 2 feet of it, coiled and held with a twist tie. He didn't keep it for any reason he could fully articulate. He just kept it. It was still there when his son cleaned out the shed in 2003. His son asked about it. Merle told him the story. The north field. The Thursday morning in September. Kevin's clipboard and the $400 quote. Roy in his jacket with his hands in his pockets, standing next to the running tractor, not saying anything. His son asked why Roy had known to check the fuel line. Merle said he supposed it was because Roy had seen a lot of things not work. His son put the hose back on the shelf. Left it there. Said it seemed right to leave it. The 40-20 was long gone by then. Running somewhere in Greene County or not. The north field had been planted and harvested 16 more times since that September morning. The ground didn't remember any of it. Fields don't keep records. They just accept whatever you put in them and give back what they can. The hose sat on the shelf. 2 feet of 3 8-inch fuel hose, still there in 2003. Probably still there now. Script word count, approximately 2,100 words. See extended version below for full 3,800 word cut. Extended version continues from the 40-20 was long gone by then. There were other machines Merle nursed through the years after the 40-20 incident. A 1974 International Harvester 1066 he bought in 1985 that had a chronic overheating problem nobody could trace. A Ford 5000 utility tractor he kept for loader work that burned a quart of oil every 6 hours. A Massey Ferguson 760 combine that shed a feeder house chain in the middle of harvest in 1989 and sat in the field for 3 days while he waited on a part from Quincy. Each one taught him something, not always what he expected. The 1066 overheating issue went 3 years before he found it. He'd had the thermostat replaced, had the radiator rotted out at a shop in Hardin, had the water pump checked twice. It ran fine in cooler weather. In July and August, when the temperature in the cab hit 95 degrees and the air in the field was thick and still, the gauge would start to climb. He learned to watch it and back off the PTO load when it approached the red line. He managed around it. Roy Simmons had told him in 1989 what he suspected. Said the coolant passages in the block were probably carboned up from years of low-grade coolant maintenance. Said it would take a full engine-out flush with a commercial cleaner to know for sure. Said the shop cost would run maybe $600 and might not solve it. Merle had thought about it. Decided to manage around it instead. He was wrong about that one. Roy was right. He sold the 1066 in 1991 with the problem unresolved. Got $5,200 for it. Would have gotten $6,500 if the cooling issue hadn't been known. He left $1,300 on the table by not spending $600 to fix it. He understood that later. Roy hadn't pushed the issue. Wasn't his style to push. He told Merle what he thought and left the decision alone. This was one of the things Merle respected about Roy Simmons. He offered what he knew and didn't attach himself to what you did with it. He wasn't interested in being right in any demonstrable way. He was interested in the machines working. Whether they worked because of his advice or despite the absence of it wasn't something he tracked. The fuel hose incident was not the first time Roy had helped Merle with equipment. In 1979, Roy had identified a cracked front axle kingpin on Merle's old Farmall 560 that would have failed under load, probably at the worst possible moment. Cost $85 in parts to fix. Might have cost someone an injury if it had let go in the field. In 1982, Roy had helped him repack the wheel bearings on the grain wagon, which had been running loose for 2 seasons without Merle noticing. In 1985, it had been a stretched combine belt that Roy had spotted during a conversation they were having about something entirely unrelated. He'd been leaning against the machine talking about the previous year's harvest and had looked at the belt and said it was going to let go before the end of the season. It let go in August. Merle had replaced it in July, a week after Roy said what he said. These were not dramatic interventions. None of them were. They were the ordinary work of a man who paid attention to machines and had 35 years of evidence about what machines did under what conditions. He applied that attention the same way he applied everything, without ceremony. The 40-20 story spread in the county the way things did. Not quickly, not loudly, but persistently. Dale Hoffman at the grain elevator had heard it by November of 1987. He told it the way farmers tell these stories, accurately, without embellishment, without a moral attached. He just said what happened. Roy looked at the fuel line. Tractor started in 10 minutes. Fuel hose cost $340. Pruitt Implement had quoted $400 to start. The story was not told as a criticism of Pruitt Implement. Dale made that clear when he told it. Kevin had done what you do. He'd run the diagnostic procedure. He'd found real problems, even if the real problems weren't the fatal problem. The story was told as a story about Roy, which was the point of it. By the following spring, 4 different farmers in Calhoun County had asked Roy about equipment problems before calling Pruitt Implement. Roy helped when he could, referred them to the shop when he couldn't. He drew that line clearly. There were things you fixed in the field with the right knowledge and the right parts. There were things you sent to the shop. Roy knew the difference. Part of what he knew was that difference. Merle's son took over primary field operations in 1991. By then, Merle was 74, and the physical work of running equipment across 340 acres was accumulating in ways he acknowledged but didn't discuss at length. He still drove the tractor, still made decisions, still knew the land the way you know something you've worked for 40 years. But his son did the bulk of the hours, and that was right. His son had grown up watching how Merle handled equipment problems, watching Roy come out to the field, watching the diagnostic process that started with what's likely before moving to what's possible. He had absorbed that approach without being taught it formally. It showed in how he handled machines as he took over. He was methodical, he was patient. He didn't panic when equipment failed. He looked at what was most likely to have failed given the age and history of the machine, and he started there. In 1993, his son diagnosed a failing injection pump on the 4020 by listening to the engine note change at different load levels. He called Roy to confirm his thinking before he ordered the part. Roy agreed with his diagnosis. The pump was replaced at Pruitt Implement for $320. The tractor ran for another year before Merle sold it. It would have failed that harvest if the pump hadn't been replaced. His son had caught it 3 weeks early. Roy didn't say anything about that. He'd confirmed what the young man had figured out himself. The knowledge was passing the way knowledge passes in rural counties where it has always passed. Not through institutions or publications, through conversations in farmyards and machine sheds and at the feed store in Hardin, where Roy Simmons had spent a portion of most mornings for 17 years not buying much of anything in particular and knowing more than he talked about. When Roy died in March of 1996, Merle drove to the funeral in Hardin on a Tuesday morning. Cold, gray weather. The church held 85 people and was 3/4 full. He sat in the back third and looked at the back of the heads of the people he'd known for most of his adult life. Dale Hoffman was there. Walt Frum, the Gerber family. Eileen Coaster, the woman whose starter solenoid Roy had diagnosed over the phone. A man named Gerald Pierce from Pike County, who had some connection Merle didn't know. The minister spoke for 20 minutes. Korean War service, family, faith. The minister was young, maybe 35, and had not known Roy well. He said the right things. They were the right things. Merle drove back to the farm afterward, made lunch, went out to the machine shed in the afternoon, looked at the shelf where the piece of fuel hose was sitting. He thought about the north field. September morning in 1987. The silence where the diesel had been. Walking the half-mile back to the house. Kevin's clipboard. The $400 minimum. Roy had asked one question. When had the fuel line last been changed? He'd driven to town, come back, and taken 10 minutes to fix what a trained mechanic hadn't found in an hour. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't magic. It was pattern recognition accumulated over decades and applied without pretension or hesitation. Roy had seen collapsed fuel lines before, had seen them fail in exactly this way, had known to check them first. The rest was just time and a pair of clamps. Merle stood in the machine shed in the gray March cold of 1996, with his hands in his jacket pockets. Same posture Roy had stood in next to the running tractor 9 years ago. He hadn't thought about that parallel before. He thought about it now. He didn't go back inside right away. Just stood there for a while. The shelf held the piece of hose until 2003, when his son cleaned out the shed before sale. His son asked what it was. Merle told him the whole story, start to finish. September morning. Fuel hose. Roy Simmons with his hands in his pockets. 10 minutes. The tractor running. His son held the hose for a moment, put it back on the shelf, said he'd keep it where it was. Merle told him it was just a piece of hose. His son said he understood that. He kept it anyway. It was still on that shelf the last time anyone thought to check.